Hello and welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you are new to the podcast, then where have you been? I'm so thankful that you've found us, and I hope you stick with us and check out the previous episodes if you haven't done so. And if you are a regular listener, then thank you so much for coming back. I truly appreciate your support and I'm very grateful. You may know that 1 in 8 women in the UK will experience breast cancer in their lifetime. And I think the assumption is that you have to be of a certain age, usually older, to get breast cancer. So maybe you have to be over 40 to get breast cancer. But in fact, that's not the case. Yes, the risk of getting breast cancer increases as we get older, but breast cancer can also affect younger women. And this is illustrated by today's guest, Helen Deverell. Helen was diagnosed with breast cancer at a relatively young age. She was in her late 20s. And I wanted Helen to come onto the show to share her story because I think it's very important to raise awareness of the fact that young women can also get breast cancer. Helen talks about her breast cancer diagnosis, how she found her breast lump, and what prompted her to examine her breast in the first place, which in itself is a very interesting story. She also talks about the challenges that she has faced in trying to move forward, and also the strategies that she has implemented to help her. So, without further ado, enjoy my conversation with Helen Deverell. Hi Helen, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And thank you for having me on. I'm excited to be part of it.
Oh, thank you. So you and I met actually at a conference in London, didn't we? Probably a few months ago now.
Yeah, back in November, I think. Yes.
Back in November. Yeah. And we got chatting and got into a really kind of interesting discussion. And you told me about your story and your experience of being diagnosed with breast cancer at a reasonably young age. And that's really one of the reasons why I invited you to come onto the show, which you've generously agreed to do so, because I wanted to share stories like yours, how women do get breast cancer at a young age. I think it's important to raise awareness about the fact that breast cancer doesn't discriminate and that it can affect women and, of course, men, both young and old. So thank you so much for agreeing to come into the show.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, of course. As you said, my name's Helen and I'm 35. And for the last 5 years, I've been trying to raise awareness of how breast cancer affects young women. I do that alongside my day job, which is being an internal communications consultant. So I work for myself and help organisations communicate effectively with their employees. And and personally, I'm married and have a black Labrador called Luna. And yes, so that's sort of me in a nutshell, really.
What age were you when you were diagnosed? Or when you discovered the lump, I guess, is the first question.
Yes, so I was 29 when I discovered the lump and was diagnosed. It all happened very quickly, actually. It was in November 2014 when I was diagnosed, and I found the lump that same month. It was, I'd been in the shower and I'd gotten into a routine fairly recently of checking every now and again. I'd seen a documentary earlier that year called Dying to Live, which had been made by Helen Deverell, who is the founder of the charity Copperfill. And she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer at the age of 23 and had been really angry that no one had ever told her how to check her boobs and had never realised that it could happen at a young age. So she set up the charity and she made this documentary, which I saw. And I remember thinking at the time that I had no idea that you could get breast cancer in your 20s and thought it was quite shocking. But I still thought, well, that won't happen to me. You know, I've got no family history or anything like that. But I still thought, well, there's no harm in checking every now and again, but sort of pushed it to the back of my mind. Right. And then about 9 months later, whilst in the shower, I did find a lump, quite a small one. So it was certainly something I wouldn't have felt unless I'd been actually checking, and went to doctors. And that later on was diagnosed as early stage breast cancer.
You started to check your breast really based on that documentary that Helen Deverell created?
Yes, purely on that. I'd never checked before. It wasn't something that was even part of my sort of thinking. I didn't have any family history of it. I thought it was something that happened to older women. So because of that documentary, I started checking sort of every now and again. just in a good, because I thought it made good sense really to know your body and to know if something changed. But it certainly, I wasn't looking for cancer. I just thought that it was good advice and something I should be doing. But I couldn't believe it when I actually found a lump. It was surreal, to be honest.
Gosh, I mean, that's a really, really powerful story, isn't it? And it just goes to show how important it is for us to be able to talk about this, because if it wasn't because of that documentary, it wouldn't have even crossed your mind to even be checking your breast. The assumption is that breast cancer only affects older women.
Absolutely. And I would go as far to say I'm not sure I would still be here because I don't know how long it would have taken for me to find that lump and how far that would have then progressed. So I think that telling your story, anyone that's been in those sorts of situations, I think it's so powerful. And that's something I do now with Copperfill. So I now volunteer with them and share my story regularly with young people and older people as well, to really raise that awareness and to get more people talking and to make it less of a scary subject and actually a really positive, empowering subject that if you catch it early, you can go on and live a normal life. And that's the message we want to get out there. It's about stamping out the late detection.
So yeah, you now do volunteer for Copperfill, and we can talk about Copperfill as an amazing charity in a bit. If we go back to your, I guess, discovery of your lump, tell me what happened after that.
So I initially went to see my GP and she didn't think it would be anything to worry about. She could feel what I was feeling, but thought it was unlikely to be anything to worry about, but sent me for some tests to be on the safe side. I went for an ultrasound at a clinic, a breast clinic, and that was when it all started to get a bit more serious. So the consultant that scanned me said at the time he didn't know what it was and I was going to need to have a biopsy and a mammogram, which I had. Right. And I knew then that something wasn't right. He'd got very serious at that point. And then the following week, I went back to the GP for the results and was told that I did have breast cancer. But at that time, you don't necessarily know what that means. You don't have all the information. All I knew was I had breast cancer. I didn't know what stage. I didn't know anything else. And I'd known nothing about cancer before that point. So I now know all kinds of terminology and things I never thought I would know. But I later found out that I had an estrogen positive tumour. It was about 1.3 centimetres. So it was quite small, grade 2 and classed as stage 1. And I was lucky that it didn't or hadn't spread to my lymph nodes. So it was quite treatable at that point. And I had a lumpectomy where they cut the lump out. I then had a short course of chemotherapy and I had radiotherapy as well. And then once I finished that active treatment, that was then on tamoxifen and Zoladex. So Zoladex for 2 years and tamoxifen for 4 years. I was very lucky in how well it was caught and the treatment was effective and was relatively, I got through that bit relatively okay. The side effects weren't too bad. But yeah, that was the diagnosis that I received. And then all in all, I was diagnosed in November and I finished active treatment the following June.
As somebody at the age of 29 to be faced with a diagnosis of breast cancer when, it's something that it's not within, I guess, your consciousness, because why would you be thinking about breast cancer at that age? And breast cancer diagnosis at any age is not something that is welcome. But at the age of 29, you get that diagnosis, you get bombarded by all of this medical terminology that, must be completely alien to you. How did that impact you at that time?
First of all, it was just complete shock and surreal. And then as a 29-year-old woman about to turn 30, I'd been married for a couple of years. My first thoughts went to, can I have children? That was next on our agenda. That was part of my plan. And I was then told that I probably could have children, but I would have to wait at least 5 years before I could even think about that. And while that wasn't a complete no, that I actually found, and I've heard other women say the same, that actually was the harder bit. Being told I had cancer was one thing, but then to be told I may or may not be able to have children and that couldn't be guaranteed, and the treatment may or may not affect my fertility, that was quite devastating. And I think at that particular age, when everyone around you is suddenly having children and you're stuck not knowing what that future holds, that can really affect you and your mental health. And I think that's the bit that isn't focused on as much, because all the focus is on obviously getting you better, which obviously I'm very appreciative of. But
Yes.
the other side of it is almost sidelined a little bit because it's not seen as the more urgent part. And I suppose the other thing as well was from a work perspective. I was off work for 7 months. I was at a point in my career where I felt like I was starting to progress and do well, and suddenly you have to step out. And as much as I suppose we all know we can't really plan life, I think you like to think you can. And I suddenly, everything I'd had planned and was just out the window, and I was suddenly facing a very different future, which is true of what, as you said, whatever age you're diagnosed. But I think as a young woman, that it is particularly difficult with the fertility aspect, and just so disruptive at that particular age that you're at.
Yeah.
And it was the age where by the time I would be, so they're 35 now, that's the age when you're starting to think, well, I really need to get on the fertility thing, because you're told as you get past 35, your fertility starts to decline. So
Yes.
suddenly I'm in a position where, well, I've got to wait 5 years, but when I get there, I don't know where I'm going to be in fertility wise. So it suddenly becomes a bit grey. And that's as bizarre as it may sound, that was the more terrifying bit than the actual cancer.
You're absolutely right. I think fertility is something that we don't talk about as much, because you get a cancer diagnosis and the overall or the overarching mission is to treat that cancer. But at the same time, if somebody who has been diagnosed with breast cancer is of a childbearing age and is still wanting to have children, if they, they might have had children but wanting more, or if they haven't started their family and are thinking of having children, fertility is something that needs to be addressed. So when you were going through the treatment, diagnosis and treatment, was the fertility issue discussed?
It was discussed, and I still see my consultants, and I'm very grateful to them for everything they did. But I think their view at the time was that, because I didn't freeze any eggs, and my oncologist particularly was quite against that. He felt because I had an estrogen receptive tumour that wouldn't be advisable.
Right.
And I think he felt that because the chemotherapy I was having was quite a mild one, and that I was going to have Zoladex, which basically would put my ovaries to sleep and protect them. And factoring in my younger age, he felt that my body would be protected and recover enough to have children later on. So that was discussed and that was agreed. But I think what I didn't realise at the time, what maybe they didn't realise, was actually after that, it got quite difficult, because I suddenly realised that I didn't have any insurance. So I had to wait 5 years, but what was to say I wouldn't get another tumour in 5 years, and then in that 5 years, and that could push me back again. And suddenly I'm going to be 37, 38 before I can try, or I might be 40. That played on my mind a lot, that I didn't have anything frozen to fall back on. And I literally had to wait that time before I could even think about anything. And I think that was the bit that I struggled with, was not having what I called my insurance, that they would be there waiting for me. So I found that quite difficult. And I think maybe looking back, I felt that maybe I should have pushed a bit harder to have that. But then I'm sure they had their reasons for why they felt that wasn't appropriate at the time. But obviously I do know of other women that did have them frozen. But it's difficult to know what the right thing to do is. And I think that is part of the problem, is, you're going into it, you're not an expert, and far from it. And suddenly you're facing this whole new world, and you have to make these decisions quite quickly. And you don't realise necessarily what impact they'll have on you after. And I personally found it very difficult. And I suppose just to qualify what I said before as well about it almost being more devastating than the cancer, obviously I was in a very privileged position of having been diagnosed early. So I had been told, chances are you're going to be okay. So maybe I would have felt differently had my prognosis not been as good, or I'd been diagnosed at a later stage. So I don't mean to be dismissive of other people in that way, but I think because of when I was diagnosed and there was a talk of a very hopeful future, I think then my focus very much went to the fertility aspect. And I felt that was something that, with hindsight, I wish we'd had maybe more discussion about, so that I could have really understood more, I think, to really understand the rationale behind that decision and what that would mean. Luckily for me, I am now currently pregnant. So
Yay, congratulations.
Thank you. So touch wood, it has worked out okay, and they were right. But that didn't stop the last 5 years in many ways being very tricky for me mentally because of that.
Well, I mean, thank you so much for sharing that, because it is a very important topic to be openly discussed and to be brought to the fore, especially for people listening out there who may be in your position, who may feel that they don't have enough information or knowledge to be able to bring it up with their with their surgeons or physicians. Because if you are unsure about something, then there's nothing wrong in asking about more information, asking for more time, because these decisions are extremely important and life-changing.
Absolutely. And I would always say that to people. I think you have to advocate for yourself, and obviously your consultants want the best for you as well. But I think you have every right to ask questions and to be able to understand why certain decisions are being made. And I think knowledge is power. And so I completely agree with that and think that's essential, because ultimately, if you are going to recover from a cancer diagnosis, which more and more people are, it is then thinking about that quality of life and what does that mean? What does that look like after? And that's an important conversation to have at the beginning as well, because that dictates treatment you have and decisions you make. And that really does matter. It's not just about getting the cancer out of your body and surviving that bit. It's what your life looks like after that as well.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Because when I see patients in my clinic and I have to give them a diagnosis, usually and understandably, they would say to me, okay, can you just take it out? And at the same time, can you do something to my other breast? And all of these reactions are understandable reactions, but I have to try to make them understand that, yes, of course, we will do everything in our power to treat your cancer. But like you said, there is life after a cancer diagnosis. And if it means that we may need a week or two to give you more time to think about the options, to think about other possible avenues like fertility, for example, to reassure them that if it is the most correct thing for that particular person, then fertility preservation may be an option. And these are all the things that we need to talk about openly and give people enough time to make that decision, because ultimately you don't want to be in a position where you look back and you think, I wish I had more of an option or an avenue to talk about this. And at that time, I didn't have the courage or the time or the opportunity to talk about it. And that's not where you want to be.
I absolutely agree. And I think that time aspect is so important. I think when you're first diagnosed, it's so incredibly overwhelming and you're trying to take on board so much information. And I think that initial reaction, and mine certainly was just give me a double mastectomy and let's just get it all off and let's, do that. And actually, it was only through talking with the consultants that I understood that in my situation, that wasn't necessary. And actually, a lumpectomy would be exactly what I needed. And I'm glad that now was what I went with in my circumstances. But I think you do have a very gut reaction, and actually taking that bit of time, if you are able to have it, to really take on board everything you've heard, think about the options, what that means, because any of the options you choose, there's no simple option, and they all have things you have to consider. And, I've often had people say to me, I think I would have just had the mastectomy and been done with it. But that's major surgery. And, that's not something to be taken lightly either. And, it's these decisions you do need to have space to think. And I think if women can be given that, and especially with the fertility stuff, I think that's really important, and to allow yourself to actually think about the questions you want to ask. And I always say to people, write your questions down in advance, take them with you, and because you can't always think on the spot. And so I think you're completely right. If we can give women that space to think, then I think that would be helpful.
Space to think, space to consider, but of course within the reassurance that time is not time wasted. It is time that is used to ultimately make the right decision, and space for that is extremely important. So for women out there, please take the time and all the time that you need to be able to make the right decision, with the guidance of those who are treating you. I'm really pleased that you went through the treatment and you coped with that. You were on tamoxifen for 4 years. You completed your treatment with that cancer diagnosis. A lot of people find it extremely difficult to move on, try to lead a normal life as they can. Some people say, this is my new normal now, and I like to know how to lead that new normal life. How are you kind of coping with life after your cancer diagnosis and your treatment, and how has it impacted your mental health in any way? Because I think you did mention earlier that it did have an impact on that.
Yes, it absolutely did. And as you say, people often talk about that it's after everything finishes that it's harder. And it's true in a way that when you've got your treatment, you're going from appointment to appointment, and there's always something to aim for. And everyone's very focused on you, and friends and family, and everyone's supporting you. And then suddenly when it's finished, that all starts to go away. And just purely because people have to get back on with their lives, your treatment is finished, you haven't got your appointments anymore, and suddenly you're just left with thinking, what on earth just happened? And trying to sort of process all of that. And you're physically different, you're emotionally different, you're mentally different. And I think for me, the last 5 years have been a real mix of things. It's there's been some really good times in the last 5 years, and some brilliant things have happened. And I've made decisions such as to set up a business and things like that I probably wouldn't have done otherwise. So it certainly hasn't been all doom and gloom, but there has been some very dark periods as well, strongly linked to the fertility. And as much as I was always told that it may well happen, I think that I started to feel very different from everyone else. Suddenly everyone else had choices and they could just have a baby because they wanted one, and I couldn't. And I had to become slowly the only one without children in many cases, and didn't even feel connected to my social groups anymore. And I suppose worried that maybe I was a bit of a figure of pity, which I don't think I ever was, but I certainly started to feel that way. And then I think when you layer on top of that from what I've understood with my diagnosis is that because it was an early stage estrogen positive, which is good, but that also means that I have a higher risk of it coming back much later. So it could come back in 10, 15, 20 years. So I think when that hangs over you and there's no way of knowing whether that will happen or not, that does hang over you. And I think you're very aware that life is short, and you want to make the most of it, but then you can also then pile on a lot of guilt on yourself if not every day is your best day. And you've got to live life to the fullest, and some days you just don't feel like it. And so you sort of tie yourself up with a lot of pressure, and there's a lot of fear, and then there's also a lot of ordinary stuff in with it all as well. And it can be a very lonely experience, because especially, and I'm assuming as a younger woman, because there's not as many people that have been there in that specific situation. So trying to find people that really understand, and I am lucky in some of my networks, and obviously being part of Copperfill, there are a lot of women that do. But day to day, trying to explain to people why you feel low or why you feel anxious when you should be on top of the world because you've got through it, that can be hard to explain that. And sometimes it's hard to even understand yourself. Why do I feel this way when I have come out the other side and it all looks positive? But sometimes it really does just sort of take its toll on you.
Did it affect your social life?
I think it has affected it to an extent. I haven't changed in the way I am socially, but I think just the age I was at when it happened is that social lives changed anyway, and people started having families, and suddenly where do you fit in with that? And as much as I was always felt like I made to feel like I could be a part of it all, it is that you feel very happy for everyone else, but you feel very sad for yourself, and you start to not be able to relate. And so I suppose it probably did affect relationships in a way. I've still kept all my friendships, and they've been hugely supportive to me, all of my friends. But I think I did feel bitter for a long time that I couldn't do that. And I think I've also resented cancer for how it has affected my relationships and how I haven't always been able to be positive. And I've probably meant that some of my friends have had to walk around me on eggshells on some of the happiest times of their life, and that's not fair on them at all. So I think it has strained relationships at times and also brought us closer together at other times. But I think it is it's not one set of emotions, it's a whole combination. And then I think just another layer is, you also have guilt in that there's so many women that didn't get to be in my position, that weren't as lucky as me, and that have passed away very young. And and I've known some of them and have met them through this cancer world I never wanted to be a part of, and some of them have died so young, in their 20s, and it's just so awful. And then you sort of think, what on earth am I feeling down for? I'm still here. So you have that sort of guilt on top of it as well. But like I said, there has been good times. It's not all been doom and gloom, but it is a very complicated set of emotions, and trying to work out what your life is meant to be now. That plan has gone out the window that I had, and trying to work out what I'm meant to do now, and this new normal that no one else really understands. And it can be very lonely.
So do you have any, strategies that you've put in place for yourself to help with these emotions and feelings? Because there must be a roller coaster of emotions, it changes, I'm sure, from one day to the next.
It does. And I have had therapy and things like that, and that helps. And I'm working with a coach at the moment. And I find talking about things, I think, you do need to be open. And I am lucky that I have friends and family that do listen and will allow me to talk about how I'm feeling. And just some of the really simple things, like I've started to just try and be kinder to myself and recognize I will feel anxious some days, I will feel down some days, but that it will pass, and it won't always be that way. And I try and remind myself of sort of it's just for now, and allow that to pass. And other days sometimes it's just reminding yourself that you're doing all right, and actually considering everything that happened. I do run a business, and I do maintain a social life, and I do volunteer for charity. And actually, some days I have to stop and say, actually, you're doing all right, and you're being too hard on yourself. But I think it's also time. I think time, as cheesy as it is, it does make it easier the further you get away from it. It is no longer the first thing. Cancer is no longer the first thing I think about when I wake up in the morning, and the last thing I think about when I go to bed. There's other things have now filled that space, and I imagine, especially now, hopefully, with having this baby, that will all start to get a bit easier.
All change.
I hope. I'm sure it'll bring a whole new set of stresses and anxieties. But I think I'm not sure if I have sort of the one sort of thing that's particularly worked. But actually, I do think exercise is really important. I run, not at the moment, but I found that was really good for my mental health to exercise and to take care of myself in that way. So I got into running, which again, luckily I've been able to do. My treatment didn't affect me to the point where I couldn't do things like that. So I think it's been a combination of things, but therapy and talking to people and being open and just trying to be a bit kinder to myself has helped a bit over the years. But the therapy was I definitely needed to do that, and I think people shouldn't be worried about saying they need help, because I definitely needed help, and it got to that point where I had to say that, and I felt very dark for a while and very low, and I think it's absolutely, people must say if they're struggling, and there is help out there.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing those. I think they're really, really good advice. And as you said, simple things like talking about it and asking for help and sharing stories like what you're doing now is so vital, because somebody out there who might be in your position right now listening to your story might actually be helped by, the knowledge that they're not alone and they're not isolated. I guess the other thing that must be helping you is also, as you said right at the beginning, is that you volunteer at Copperfill. For those who don't know what Copperfill is, can you tell us a little bit about what it is and what it is that you do with them?
Sure. So it's a charity, as I said, that was set up by Chris Halenga and her twin sister Maren after Chris was diagnosed with breast cancer at the age of 23. So the aim of the charity is to sort of educate young people around breast cancer, men and women, because men can get breast cancer as well. And that's something a lot of people don't know. So we try to raise awareness of that as well. And to empower young people to really get to know their own bodies, to know what's normal for them. And we're really clear on that. We're not telling people to go looking for cancer. We're telling them to know your body, know what's normal, and have the confidence to go to the doctor if something changed, and to know that still doesn't mean it's cancer. It just means you need to be proactive and get it checked out to be sure. So as part of that, the charity does lots of things. So there's women like me. I'm one of their bouvettes, and the bouvettes are all women who were either diagnosed, had a scare, or carry the BRCA gene, all under the age of 35. And we go into schools and workplaces and tell our stories to raise this awareness and to raise awareness of the signs and symptoms as well. And I think by telling our stories, it's so much more powerful, because when I stand up in a room full of school children, even at 35, I don't seem a million miles away from them. And they usually are quite shocked that I stand there and say, I've had breast cancer. And some of the women doing it are younger than me as well. And so, it has such a powerful impact on people. Charity also does lots of other things as well. It has a uni-boob team who work at universities, we go to festivals, we do lots of fundraising and awareness in other ways as well. So we're a very proactive charity. We try to be a fun charity, because we are trying to appeal to younger people and try to make it a subject that is just normal to talk about, and it's not embarrassing. And as I said, that young people are empowered to know if ultimately 1 in 2 of us are going to get cancer in our lifetimes, then we should be talking about it, and we should be knowing what the signs and symptoms are and what to do, so that more people can survive it. And so I think it's a really important conversation to be having. I do also work with Breast Cancer Care, which has just become part of Breast Cancer Now. So I do work with them it's called Someone Like Me. So
Right.
I get paired with someone, usually younger women who want to talk about who've just been diagnosed. And I'm just someone they can chat to. So I'm not a trained therapist or anything like that. I'm just purely that buddy role. And I can just listen. I can share my experiences and hopefully make them feel less alone. And that was a service I used myself when I was diagnosed as well. So I also find that's another good way of it's not so much sharing my story as openly, but it's just that one-to-one helping someone feel less alone and being able to ask questions and did that happen to you? Was that normal? And it just allows me to support other women in that way as well. So it's another element of how I volunteer.
Wow. So you volunteer for Copperfill and you volunteer for Breast Cancer Now as a buddy. So much amazing work that you're doing outside of your normal working life and your business and being a wife and soon to be mother. How do you juggle it all?
I have to be quite organised, but I feel very passionately about it, and I'm extremely grateful to Copperfill because I do feel very strongly that I wouldn't have had the same prognosis had it not been for the work they do, and I feel it's only right that I pay that forward and share my story with others because it works, and I'm evidence of that. And as I feel able to do it, and again, so that's not a judgment on anyone that doesn't feel able to share their story because it's a very personal thing that happens, and we don't all have to become breast cancer campaigners. It's a very personal journey, and you've got to find your own way through it. But for me, I found that being active and sharing my story I find quite cathartic, and it helps me, and I hope it helps other people that I share it with. So I'm very happy to do it.
Copperfill is an amazing charity, and I'll leave all the links in the show notes after this for people to find out more about them as a charity. And I think they are going from strength to strength, really. They're spreading breast cancer awareness far and wide. They're getting young people engaged, and definitely check them out because I think it's an amazing charity. And what you do is so worthwhile, and it must be quite, fulfilling for you to do as well, I suspect.
It is. It is fulfilling, and it's always nice when you have people come up to you and thank you or tell you their stories, or you hear of. I've had women email me to say that they went and got something checked because of me telling my story and being open about it, and luckily so far they've all been fine. No one has been diagnosed that I'm aware of, but the fact that they've felt that they could go to the doctors and they could be brave enough to say, actually, no, I want to have this checked out and I need you to take me seriously. That feels great. And I think as well, when younger people come up to us, I often have children at schools come up to me to tell me about their mums or their aunts, and they just want to tell someone. They just want to say it out loud, and I feel very privileged to be able to be that person they can say it to, and to to give them some sort of comfort, I suppose. So yeah, it is a very rewarding thing to do as well. Yeah.
For those who want to find you, if people want to connect with you, where should they go?
So I'm on Twitter at Helen Deverell, so you can find me on there, and I'm also on LinkedIn as well. So you just search my name. I don't think there's many Helen Deverells out there, so I'm sure you'll find me quite easily. Yeah, and obviously the Copperfill website as well, where you can book bets to come into your schools or workplaces, and we can do presentations and run stalls and things like that. So all that information's on there as well.
Okay, fantastic. So that's Deverell, that's Deverell.
Yes, that's right, yes.
Great. I'll also link those in the show notes as well. Well, Helen, thank you so much for your time. I think you're doing an amazing job. And by sharing your story, I am sure those listening out there who may be in your position will find strength and comfort in knowing that they're not alone. And, they may want to connect with you to have a chat with you, DM you, check out Copperfill, because again, that's an amazing organization. And finally, do you have any parting words to those listeners out there?
Just really that to encourage women and men to check their boobs, their breasts and their pecs, and to be just conscious of their own bodies, and to realise that actually early detection is the best form of defence, and it doesn't have to be this death sentence that cancer used to be. It can be really empowering to be in control of your body and to take that action, and actually you can go on to live a perfectly normal life. So I just hope that people do take this away, that it can happen to anyone at any age, but actually if we're proactive about it, it can be an inconvenience rather than something that's ultimately life-ending. So I hope that people take that away from this.
Thank you so much, Helen, and catch up with you soon. Take care.
No problem. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you once again to Helen for coming onto the podcast. Do connect with Helen on social at Helen Deverell, that's Deverell, and say hi. I'm sure she'd love to connect with you. And if you would like references of all the things that we talked about today, then do head to the show notes at www.mybreastmyhealth.com/episode 10. And by the way, if you would like to support the podcast, I would be ever so grateful if you could leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. And what this does, it actually makes the show more discoverable to people. So that way, more people can listen to it and hopefully benefit from it.